Brilliant. She knew you only deserved this piece of trash. My brother Edward burst into laughter, his voice echoing through the mahogany-paneled office. I sat there, stunned, clutching the brass key that Harrison Phillips, our family attorney, had just handed me. The old wooden box sat before me on the polished conference table, looking so ordinary next to all the legal documents scattered around us. My name is Bethany Crow, and at 37 years old, I never imagined this moment would feel so humiliating. After working a double shift at Denver General Hospital, I had rushed here still wearing my scrubs, my hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, exhaustion weighing heavy on my shoulders. Meanwhile, Edward had arrived in his tailored designer suit, his confidence radiating through the room like he already owned everything in it. The reading of our mother Margaret's will should have been a time of mourning, a moment to honor the woman who had raised us after our father died when I was just 16. Instead, it felt like a public execution of my dignity. Harrison had just finished reading the initial will, which left me nothing but this weathered wooden box that our mother had kept locked under her bed for as long as I could remember. Edward was set to inherit the vast majority of our family's $15 million estate, including the sprawling ranch house in Boulder, the investment properties, and all the stocks and bonds that had sustained our family for generations. I mean, look at her, Edward continued, gesturing at my hospital uniform with undisguised contempt. Still playing nurse at her age, living in that cramped apartment with her kid. Mother finally realized who the real success story is in this family. The words cut deep, but they weren't entirely surprising. Edward had always been the golden child, the one who charmed everyone with his smooth talk and expensive gifts. At 41, he lived in a luxury penthouse downtown, drove a BMW, and worked in some vague business consulting role that seemed to require more networking than actual work. He had spent years cultivating the image of the perfect son, the one who would carry on the family legacy with style and sophistication. I looked down at the simple wooden box, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. There was something almost mocking about it sitting there among all the official legal documents. Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension in the room. The afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the conference table, making the whole scene feel surreal and dreamlike. What had our mother been thinking, leaving me this old box while giving Edward everything else? After everything I had sacrificed, all the nights I had worked extra shifts to pay for nursing school, all the times I had visited her when Edward was too busy with his social calendar. The injustice of it all made my chest tighten with a mixture of grief and disbelief. Growing up, things had been different between Edward and me. Before our father's sudden death from a heart attack, we had been a typical family. Our mother Margaret worked as a school principal, our father owned a small but successful construction company, and we lived comfortably in a modest home in Aurora. Edward was 4 years older than me, and back then, he had actually been protective of his little sister. We would spend summer afternoons riding bikes through the neighborhood, and he would help me with my math homework without complaint. But everything changed after Dad died. Suddenly, our family was thrust into wealth we had never expected. Dad's construction company was bought out by a larger corporation for millions, and various insurance policies and investments left us with more money than we knew what to handle. Mother was overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing such wealth while grieving, and Edward seemed to transform overnight from a protective older brother into someone I barely recognized. He became obsessed with appearances and status. At 18, he convinced Mother to buy him an expensive car, claiming it was necessary for his college image. He enrolled in an expensive private university, changed his wardrobe entirely, and started running with a crowd of wealthy kids who looked down on anyone who wasn't from old money. When I was still struggling through high school, dealing with my own grief and trying to help Mother manage her new responsibilities, Edward was learning how to manipulate social situations to his advantage. By the time I graduated and told Mother I wanted to become a nurse, Edward was openly dismissive. "Why waste time with some blue-collar job?" he had said during one particularly harsh family dinner. "We have money now, Bethany. You could do something important." something that matters. But nursing did matter to me. I had spent so many hours in the hospital with Dad before he died, watching the nurses who showed genuine compassion and skill. I wanted to help people the way they had helped our family during the darkest time. Edward never understood that. He saw my career choice as beneath our family's new station, an embarrassment that reflected poorly on him when he was trying to establish himself in Denver's social circles. When I got pregnant at 25 with my daughter Emma, and Emma's father disappeared rather than take responsibility, Edward's disappointment reached new heights. "Great," he had muttered when Mother told him the news. "Now she's going to be a single mother and a nurse. What will people think?" Mother had been supportive through it all, helping with Emma when she could, and never making me feel ashamed of my choices. But I had noticed over the years how Edward worked to undermine my relationship with her. He would make subtle comments about my financial struggles, my long work hours, the small apartment Emma and I shared. He painted himself as the responsible son who was building something important, while portraying me as the daughter who was content with mediocrity. Sitting in that conference room now, I realized just how effective his campaign had been. Somehow, he had convinced our mother that he deserved the lion's share of our family's wealth. The months leading up to Mother's death had been particularly difficult for me, though I didn't realize how much Edward had been manipulating the situation behind the scenes. Mother had been diagnosed with lung cancer the previous spring, despite never smoking a day in her life. The doctors said it was environmental, possibly related to years of exposure to construction dust from Dad's business, but the cause didn't matter as much as the reality that we were losing her. I had immediately rearranged my work schedule to spend more time with her, picking up extra shifts on weekends to make up for the reduced hours during the week. Emma, now 12, would often come with me to visit her grandmother after school. We would sit in Mother's sunroom, playing cards and talking about everything and nothing. Mother seemed to cherish these quiet moments, and I thought I was doing the right thing by prioritizing time with her over the financial stress it was causing. What I didn't know was that Edward was using my absence during his visits to plant seeds of doubt about my motives. Harrison would later tell me that Edward had spent considerable effort portraying my increased attention as self-serving. "She's only coming around more because she knows you're dying," he had apparently said on multiple occasions. "She's worried about the inheritance. She thinks if she plays the devoted daughter now, you'll forget about how distant she's been all these years." The cruel irony was that I had actually been distant, but not by choice. Working as a nurse, especially as a single mother, meant long hours and constant exhaustion. There were weeks when I barely saw Emma except to help her with homework and make sure she had clean clothes for school. Finding time to visit Mother regularly had always been a struggle, something that filled me with guilt, but seemed impossible to change without sacrificing my job security. Edward, meanwhile, had all the time in the world. His consulting work seemed to consist mainly of lunch meetings and networking events. He could drop by Mother's house on a whim, bearing expensive flowers and exotic teas, regaling her with stories of his business successes and social connections. He made sure she knew about every minor setback in my life. The month I was late on rent, the time Emma got suspended for talking back to a teacher, the car repairs that forced me to ask Mother for a small loan. The worst part was discovering that during Mother's final weeks, when she was heavily medicated and often confused, Edward had apparently spent hours talking to her about the future of the family wealth. Harrison later mentioned that Edward had brought up concerns about my ability to manage money responsibly, given my struggles as a single mother. He had positioned himself as the stable, reliable choice to preserve the family legacy, while subtly suggesting that leaving me a significant inheritance would be enabling my irresponsible lifestyle. Sitting in that conference room, holding the key to a wooden box while Edward gloated about inheriting millions, I felt the full weight of his manipulation crushing down on me. I had been so focused on loving our mother and spending quality time with her that I hadn't realized she was being systematically turned against me. "Sorry, Bethany, and here's the key," Harrison said gently, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine sympathy. His weathered face showed years of handling delicate family situations, and I could see in his eyes that he felt uncomfortable with the whole proceeding. He slid the small brass key across the polished conference table, and it made a tiny scraping sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent room. I picked up the key with trembling fingers, feeling its weight. It was old, probably from the 1970s based on its design, with an ornate head and a simple shaft. Edward was practically bouncing in his leather chair with excitement, clearly enjoying every moment of my humiliation. His perfectly styled hair caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, and his expensive cologne filled the air with its sickeningly sweet scent. "Go ahead. Open it," Edward urged, his voice dripping with mock encouragement. "Let's see what treasures Mother thought you deserved." He chuckled again, the sound making my stomach churn. "Maybe it's some old family photos or her jewelry from the 1960s. You know, sentimental stuff for the sentimental daughter." Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Edward, perhaps we should maintain some decorum during this difficult time," he said quietly, but Edward waved him off dismissively. "Oh, come on, Harrison. We're all family here. Besides, I'm sure Bethany is curious too. Aren't you, Beth?" He used my childhood nickname with such condescending familiarity that I wanted to scream. I mean, after all these years of wondering what was in Mother's mysterious locked box, now you finally get to find out. The wooden box sat before me, about the size of a shoebox but deeper, made from what looked like oak or maple. Its surface was worn smooth by decades of handling, and I could see scratches and small dents that told the story of its long existence. There was a simple brass lock mechanism on the front, tiny but sturdy. My hands shook as I inserted the key, and I had to try twice before it turned with a soft click. Edward leaned forward eagerly, his eyes bright with anticipation of whatever embarrassment awaited me inside. "This is better than Christmas morning," he said with genuine glee. "I wonder if she left you a note explaining why you deserved so little. Maybe some helpful advice about budgeting on a nurse's salary." I lifted the lid slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The box was lined with faded blue velvet, and inside, rather than the photo albums or jewelry Edward had mockingly suggested, there was a manila envelope. It was thick, much thicker than I would have expected for a simple keepsake or memento. Across the front, in Mother's careful handwriting, were the words, "My true will, to be opened only by Bethany Crow." The room fell silent. Edward's laughter died in his throat as he read the words on the envelope. Harrison leaned forward, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "That's unusual," he murmured, reaching for his reading glasses. I wasn't aware of any second document. "What does it say?" Edward demanded, his voice suddenly sharp with concern. "What kind of true will?" "Harrison, you're her lawyer. You should know about any other documents." Harrison looked genuinely puzzled. "Margaret never mentioned any additional paperwork to me. This is highly irregular." He gestured toward the envelope. "May I see that, Bethany?" My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the envelope steady. The paper felt heavy, substantial, like it contained much more than just a letter. Through the manila, I could feel what seemed like multiple documents, possibly even photographs. "My true will," I read aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. Edward's confident demeanor was beginning to crack around the edges. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier smugness. "There's no such thing as a true will. Harrison, tell her this doesn't mean anything. The real will is the one you just read." Harrison adjusted his glasses and leaned back in his leather chair, his expression troubled. "I have to admit, this is unprecedented in my 40 years of practice. Margaret never mentioned any secondary documents or alternate arrangements. However," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "if this envelope contains a properly witnessed and notarized will that predates the document I just read, it could potentially supersede the previous version." Edward's face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan. "That's impossible," he said firmly. but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Mother would have told us if she was changing her will. She would have discussed it with Harrison. This is probably just some sentimental letter or old family documents. It doesn't mean anything legally. Actually, Harrison continued, his lawyer's mind clearly working through the possibilities. There have been cases where individuals have chosen to keep their true intentions private, especially in families where there might be concerns about undue influence or manipulation. He looked directly at Edward as he said this, and I saw my brother flinch slightly. I carefully opened the envelope, my fingers still trembling with nervous energy. Inside, there were indeed multiple documents, exactly as I had suspected. The first was a thick legal document, clearly a will based on its format and official appearance. It was dated just 3 months ago, making it much more recent than the version Harrison had read. Below that were several photographs, and underneath everything was a sealed letter addressed to me personally. The date on this will is October 15th, I said, my voice growing stronger as I realized the implications. That's almost 2 months after the will you just read, Harrison. Edward stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the wall with a sharp bang. Let me see that, he demanded, reaching across the table. This is some kind of mistake or fraud. Mother was heavily medicated in October. She wasn't thinking clearly. Harrison held up a hand to stop Edward's advance. Please, let's handle this properly. Bethany, may I examine the document? I handed him the will with hands that were no longer shaking. As he began to read, his eyebrows climbed higher and higher on his forehead. After several minutes of careful review, he looked up with an expression of amazement. This appears to be a legitimate legal document, he said slowly. It's properly formatted, notarized, and witnessed. According to this will, Margaret Crow leaves 80% of her estate to Bethany Crow and 20% to Edward Crow. He paused, letting the words sink in. Furthermore, there's a detailed explanation of her reasoning for this distribution. The blood drained completely from Edward's face. He stood frozen for a moment, then suddenly exploded into action. That's impossible, he shouted, grabbing the edge of the conference table. She'd promised me the majority. We discussed it dozens of times. She knew I was the responsible one, the one who would preserve the family wealth. Edward, please calm down, Harrison said firmly. Let me finish reading the supporting documents. But Edward was beyond calm. His carefully constructed facade of sophistication and control was crumbling before my eyes. This is a fake, he declared, his voice rising to a near scream. Someone forged this. Maybe Bethany did it herself. She had access to Mother's house. She could have planted this box. This whole thing is a setup. I found my voice at last. Edward, stop. Just stop. The words came out stronger than I felt inside, but seeing his panic gave me confidence. You know Mother always kept that box locked. You've made jokes about it for years, wondering what was inside. This isn't a fake. Harrison continued reading, his expression growing more serious with each page. There are extensive notes here detailing Margaret's observations over the past several years. It appears she documented numerous instances of what she perceived as manipulative behavior and financial pressure from Edward, while also noting Bethany's consistent care and sacrifice. Harrison cleared his throat and began reading from Mother's letter, his voice taking on a formal legal tone. I have spent the last several years carefully observing both of my children, and I have come to understand that my initial assessment of their characters was fundamentally flawed. I was influenced by Edward's charm and apparent success, but I failed to see the manipulation beneath his polished exterior. Edward slammed his hand on the conference table, making all the papers jump. This is insane, he shouted. She was dying, Harrison. She was on morphine, and who knows what other medications. She wasn't competent to make these kinds of decisions. Harrison held up a finger for silence and continued reading. Edward has spent the past 5 years pressuring me for advances on his inheritance. claiming various business opportunities that required immediate capital. When I refused, he would become angry and manipulative, suggesting that my unwillingness to support him showed a lack of faith in his abilities. He made it clear that he expected the majority of the estate and felt entitled to it based on his education and social connections. My jaw dropped as Harrison read these words. I had known Edward was materialistic and entitled, but I hadn't realized he had been actively pressuring Mother for money. No wonder she had seemed stressed and worried during her final months. I had attributed her anxiety to her illness, never imagining that her own son was adding financial pressure to her emotional burden. Meanwhile, Harrison continued, Bethany has never asked me for anything beyond small emergency loans, which she always repaid promptly. She works double shifts to support her daughter, while still finding time to visit me regularly. When I was diagnosed with cancer, she immediately rearranged her entire schedule to spend more time with me, despite the financial hardship this caused her family. Edward's confident posture completely collapsed. He sank back into his chair, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. She turned her against me, he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. Bethany must have said something, poisoned her mind somehow. Harrison wasn't finished reading. I have included photographs of the gifts Edward brought me during my illness, all of which had price tags still attached, showing that he considered these visits a financial investment rather than expressions of love. I also have documentation of the 3 separate occasions when he asked me to revise my will to increase his share, claiming that Bethany's lifestyle choices made her unfit to handle substantial wealth. The photographs Harrison mentioned were indeed in the envelope, and as he spread them out on the conference table, I could see the evidence of Edward's calculated approach to caregiving. Expensive flower arrangements with price tags visible, bottles of wine that still bore the store stickers showing their cost, even gift cards that highlighted their denominations. Each image told the story of someone who thought love could be purchased and measured. The final reason for my decision, Harrison read, his voice growing quieter, is that I have observed Bethany's genuine grief over her father's death and her authentic care for me during my illness. Edward's visits always included requests for money or discussions about inheritance. Bethany's visits were simply about spending time together. One child sees me as a bank account. The other sees me as a mother. Edward stood up slowly, his movements mechanical and strange. His face had gone from red to white, and he was staring at the photographs spread across the table like they were evidence of a crime. "This can't be happening," he whispered. "I planned everything so carefully. I was supposed to inherit the money. I need that money." The desperation in his voice was unlike anything I had ever heard from my confident, manipulative brother. For the first time in 20 years, Edward's mask had completely slipped away. The transformation in Edward was immediate and devastating. His perfectly styled hair fell across his forehead as he bent forward, gripping the edge of the conference table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The expensive suit that had made him look so confident and successful just minutes ago now seemed like a costume he was wearing for a role he had lost. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking with desperation. "I've already made commitments based on this inheritance. I bought the penthouse assuming I would have the money to pay for it. I've been living on credit for months, waiting for this day." Harrison folded the documents neatly, his professional demeanor never wavering despite the drama unfolding before him. "According to the legitimate will, the one your mother intended to be her final testament, you will inherit 20% of the estate, Edward. That's still approximately $3 million. Most people would consider that quite substantial." $3 million? Edward's voice rose to almost a shriek. "I was counting on 12 million. Do you know what I owe? The mortgage on the penthouse alone is $8,000 a month. The car payments, the credit cards, the country club membership I can't afford to cancel because of my business connections." He ran his hands through his hair, destroying his careful styling. "I built my entire lifestyle around getting that inheritance." I watched my brother's meltdown with a mixture of satisfaction and genuine shock. I had never seen him lose control like this. had never realized how precarious his financial situation really was. All these years, I had envied his apparent success while struggling to make ends meet on a nurse's salary, never imagining that his wealth was largely an illusion, built on borrowed money and future expectations. Furthermore, Harrison continued calmly, your mother included specific instructions that your 20% inheritance be placed in a trust with structured payments over 10 years, specifically to prevent you from squandering it impulsively. She was quite thorough in her planning. The words hit Edward like physical blows. A trust meant he couldn't access the full amount immediately, couldn't use it to solve his pressing financial crisis. His face crumpled completely, and for a moment, he looked like the frightened little boy I remembered from our childhood, the one who used to cry when Dad scolded him for breaking something. Edward's final desperate act came without warning. In a burst of rage that seemed to consume all his remaining composure, he drew back his fist and punched the mahogany-paneled wall behind him with tremendous force. The sound echoed through the quiet office like a gunshot, and I saw his knuckles split open immediately, blood beginning to drip onto Harrison's expensive carpet. "This is not happening," he screamed, cradling his injured hand against his chest. "I will contest this will. I'll prove she wasn't competent. I'll drag this through court for years if I have to." Harrison stood up slowly, his patience finally at its limit. "Edward, I need you to understand something very clearly. Your mother came to me 3 months ago, completely lucid and accompanied by 2 additional witnesses specifically to ensure the validity of this document. She anticipated that you might challenge her decision, so she took extraordinary precautions to make the will legally unassailable." The lawyer walked over to his filing cabinet and retrieved another thick folder. "She also provided me with extensive documentation of her mental competence, including recent medical evaluations and cognitive assessments. Furthermore, she recorded a video statement explaining her reasoning, specifically addressing her concerns about your behavior and her confidence in Bethany's character." Edward's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the office. His injured hand was leaving small drops of blood on his expensive suit jacket, creating dark stains that seemed symbolic of his entire situation. "She knew," he whispered, the realization finally hitting him. "She knew exactly what I was doing, and she was planning this the whole time." He looked at me with something approaching hatred. "While you were playing the perfect daughter, she was setting me up to fail." I found my voice, surprised by how steady it sounded. "No, Edward. While I was being a loving daughter, you were proving exactly why she made the right choice." Edward's lifestyle collapsed almost immediately after the will reading. Within 3 months, he was forced to sell his luxury penthouse at a significant loss when he couldn't maintain the mortgage payments. His BMW was repossessed, and his country club membership was revoked for non-payment of dues. The social circle that had once admired his apparent wealth abandoned him when they learned about his financial struggles and his mother's letter documenting his manipulative behavior. His consulting business, which had relied heavily on networking and the appearance of success, crumbled as potential clients lost confidence in someone who couldn't manage his own finances. Edward's attempts to contest the will failed miserably when the court reviewed Margaret's extensive documentation of her mental competence and her detailed reasoning for the inheritance distribution. While the legal fees consumed much of his reduced inheritance, leaving him bitter, broke, and alone. As I established the Margaret Crow Foundation for Single Mothers in Nursing, using a portion of my inheritance to help women facing the same struggles I had overcome, I realized that my mother's final gift had been far more valuable than money alone. She had shown me that genuine love and sacrifice would always triumph over manipulation and entitlement, and that sometimes the most profound revenge comes not from seeking to harm those who wronged you, but simply from living authentically while watching them face the natural consequences of their own choices. In the end, Mother had taught me that the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, but discovering that you never needed their approval to build a meaningful and fulfilling life.